Guys, welcome to a classic film review of Darkman. This is the 1990 superhero movie directed by Sam Raimi and starring Liam Neeson and Frances McDormand. And if I told you the IMDb plot synopsis for this film read, a brilliant scientist left for dead returns to exact revenge on the people who burned him alive, you may think that sounds maybe overly familiar in the superhero saturated age of crossovers and multiverses, but this is no ordinary entry into the genre. Now, Raimi, of course, would direct the 2000 Spider-Man trilogy and the Doctor Strange sequel, but here he delivers an R-rated action film that features a character who didn't originate from any comic book, although it eventually became one. Fresh off delivering one of the most outrageous horror movies of all time in Evil Dead 2, and he brought us one of the most outrageous superhero movies of all time. Let's take a look.
I told you everything!
I know, Rick. I know you did. But let's pretend you didn't.
So, Darkman was released in an era that'll be quite strange to modern audience members, I think, in that the superhero movie was a subgenre of action-adventure movies, as opposed to basically the mechanism that's keeping the film industry afloat like it is today. And I'll mention a few other films of the late 80s and early 90s that sit in a similar category a little further into the video. But for now, here we have the story of a brilliant scientist, Peyton Westlake, played by Liam Neeson, who's tirelessly working on a formula for synthetic skin and comes close, but is only able to have the skin survive for 99 minutes in the light anyway. Now his lawyer girlfriend, played by Frances McDormand, has some dirt that ties a bent politician to local mobsters, and when said mobsters turn up at Peyton's lab, they make sure he's beaten, hideously mutilated and horrifically burned, and then blown up. Now, after escaping hospital, a believed dead Peyton decides to track down and punish the mobsters one by one, using a makeshift secret lair/laboratory and his synthetic skin technology to assume multiple disguises.
Dios mío, ¿qué pasa? There's two of those son of a bitches!
Now, as I mentioned, this is no family-friendly superhero origin story. Sam Raimi, fresh off two Evil Dead movies, here melds horror, heroics, comedy and pretty much every visual trick in the book in a way that we wouldn't see again until about 26 years later with a film like Deadpool. And maybe that's one of the reasons audiences didn't initially take to it.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet.
Now, what Raimi and co do here is take reference from about every 1930s horror classic there is, from Frankenstein to The Hunchback of Notre Dame, from The Mummy to The Phantom of the Opera, and fuses them into a grisly anti-hero origin story that lavishly slaps on strokes of silent cinema and sometimes Looney Tunes-esque comedy. Now, these elements that in 1990 would have probably alienated an audience that had just experienced the cultural phenomenon of Tim Burton's 1989 Batman, but they're the same elements that make this a fantastically entertaining cult oddity, even today, 30 odd years later. So at the time of release, some felt that Liam Neeson was miscast here, and I think this was his first actual leading role, in fact. And don't get me wrong, in some scenes I've got no idea which accent he's going for, and it works a lot better once his makeup is on and he can just growl his dialogue. But on the whole, he's great. Now, he's obviously got the build at 6'3" or 6'4", he's imposing, although I'm not sure, in true face-off style, where that height goes to when he's impersonating some other obviously shorter characters of different builds, but we won't worry about that. But Neeson's also got the acting chops not only to work beneath heavy and impressive makeup, but swing between being a nice guy and losing his cool when his dark personality begins to break through. And he's got no qualms about going totally bonkers when his character begins to lose it.
Maybe I should be wearing a funny little hat. Do you like it? Yeah? Yeah? See you dancing freak. Pay $5. Just $5. Yeah.
Now, the plot here itself isn't particularly unique. Wrong man seeks vengeance, etc., etc. But the mechanic of having the synthetic skin and the various disguises being used to tear the big bad gang apart is entertainingly used, even though the apparent ease at which faces and clothing can be swapped about would give Tom Cruise and his Mission Impossible buddies a run for their money. Now, I love that Darkman, despite being set in the present day, has a real 30s film noir crime movie feeling to it. An early warehouse gang war is only missing the black and white photography and Tommy guns. And while we're discussing villainy, shout out to Larry Drake's Robert G. Durant as the film's gangster boss villain who goes around cutting people's fingers off with his cigar cutter. Now that's creepy enough, but then later it's revealed that he's some weird fetishistic finger collector.
Either he provides the revenues owed to us, or he becomes part of my collection. It would make a nice addition.
That's right.
Which reminds me of some of those wacky caricatured villains from 30s era Dick Tracy. Now, Frances McDormand, still early in her career here, is the love interest. Her lawyer with integrity is pretty much the catalyst for all the trouble, really. And although McDormand apparently fought with the director during production over her character being just a damsel in distress, ultimately, though, she is just a damsel in distress. But Raimi may not be totally to blame, as he claimed the studio interfered so much that the finished film was not the movie he set out to make. Studio wouldn't do that, would it? Also, a quick shout out here to the lovely Jenny Agutter. God knows why she's in this movie, but she appears in one scene as a nurse.
Damn it, let me through!
However, in spite of this, it's undoubtedly a Sam Raimi movie. His fingerprints are all over it. If you've seen any of his movies, you'll recognise those crazy angles, crash zooms, and the tone that bounces from playfully daft to truly horrific. Those things sometimes happening simultaneously.
Excuse me.
So as I mentioned earlier, Darkman wasn't an existing property, but Raimi came to create it after failed attempts to make movies from The Shadow and Batman. It was released in a summer dominated by movies like Die Hard 2, Total Recall, Dick Tracy, and the box office giant of the year, Ghost. So it was kind of lost amongst the herd, really, but for better or worse, it would go on to have an afterlife of its own with 2 straight-to-video sequels with Arnold Vosloo taking over the lead character in both Darkman 2 and the brilliantly titled Darkman 3, Die, Darkman, Die. So Darkman arrived in an era that was a decade removed from the first Superman movie, and the genre was pretty much thought dead after the so bad it must be a joke Superman 4, The Quest for Peace in 1987. 1989, as we mentioned, would be pivotal. Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson went head-to-head in a movie that reinvented the genre and blockbuster movies full stop. And as that film and its sequels dominated the box office and pop culture, studios attempted to ride the wave with films such as this, Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, The Shadow, The Phantom. However, ironically, it would be Sam Raimi again returning to the genre in 2002 with Spider-Man that would open the floodgates for the superhero tsunami that continues to this day. So, for all its crazy little flaws, Darkman is a brilliant little cult classic, arriving in an age where superhero movies could be just 90 minutes long, and with a zany Batman on steroids score by Danny Elfman, it revels in its own cartoon silliness. Raimi's sheer joy of filmmaking leaps off the screen here, balancing cinematic nostalgia with cutting-edge science, dark questions of morality and mental health with a cracking old-school revenge flick. Go check it out.